Can you all hear me? Okay. Just? Okay, I'll speak up. Well, thank you very much for coming. Today, as you all know, the discussion is about the realignment in the Arab world. What does it mean for three pivotal states in the Middle East? Iran, Saudi Arabia and Israel. And I'd like to thank the panel for being here. Marwan Bishara is the Al Jazeera senior political analyst. Abdul Bari Atwan is the editor-in-chief of Al-Quds Al-Arabi, which is a major pan-Arab independent newspaper. And William Morris is the Secretary General of the Next Century Foundation, was a journalist as well, and a long experience in the Middle East. So thanks all for being here. I've introduced you very, very briefly. I'm going to give, to start with, just to explain how I see things going. We're going to have a discussion. I'm not going to ban questions. If you have a burning question in the first part of the discussion, then, and it's very relevant to what we're saying, then please raise your hand and we will hear your question, and you can ask it to any member of the panel. However, there will be a second part. The next 45 minutes of the discussion will be an open Q&A session, so you can ask any questions you want then. But during the first 45 minutes, if you have a burning question about what's been said, then please do raise your hand and we will hear your question, hopefully hear some honest answers as well. I'm going to ask each one of the panelists to introduce themselves in relation to the topic today, a bit more if they want to say a few more things, and for each one to say very briefly what they think about one of those countries that I've just mentioned: Israel, Iran and Saudi Arabia. So if I start with you, Marwan, and if you can tell us what you think, very briefly, 2 minutes each, on the Iran issue and what's happening in the Middle East.
You know, if we go back just a few weeks before it all started in December, January, if I take you back to the fall of 2010, we will all remember the big news was the titles in Al-Quds, in Al Jazeera and everywhere else. Ahmadinejad did this and Ahmadinejad did that. Ahmadinejad spoke at the UN and invoked this time 9/11 conspiracy theories. Ahmadinejad visited South Lebanon and he spoke here and there. The headlines were dominated by Ahmadinejad, by the way, just as much as they were dominated by Prime Minister Netanyahu says no to this and no to that. And Prime Minister Erdogan, of course, very excited about this and that and the other thing. So everyone was excited, the Israelis, the Saudis, the Iranians and the Turks, when the Arabs were, of course, nowhere to be seen. So as soon as the Arab revolt, upheaval, uprising and so on emerged in the Arab world, what was most deafening was the silence from Tehran, Riyadh and Tel Aviv, for that matter. So in a sense, you could say that from the first instant, Tehran was silent, no longer that chatty leadership, that chatty power in the region. Now, on the short term, as a lot of my friends would have argued, Tehran would have seriously benefited from more representative Arab leaders who would probably be speaking geopolitically something closer to Tehran in terms of the overall relationship between the region and the outside powers. Okay. I think, on the long term, a democratic Arab world, if it does succeed to be as such, will not be a good thing for the Ayatollahs in Tehran.
Okay, thank you very much. Abdul Bari Atwan. And Saudi Arabia.
What a nice subject. Maybe nobody wants to talk about it. So. Saudi Arabia was the most shaken country in the Middle East when the Arab Spring started in Tunisia and then actually on Egypt. Why it was very shaken? Simply because if you ask me what is the first country should face protest, uprising, revolution, I will say Saudi Arabia. Simply because if you compare Saudi Arabia with Egypt and Tunisia, you will find, or even Yemen, you will find the two countries at least, or the three countries at least, they have parliament, they have election, they have ballot box, they have some sort of freedom of expression. But when you look at Saudi Arabia, there is no independent judicial system, there is no parliament, they don't know what election means, they don't know what human rights is. It is very autocratic regimes, and so people actually extremely suppressed. So we were surprised when the Arab Revolution started in the fringe of the Arab world, Tunisia first, and then actually to Egypt. But nothing actually happened in Saudi Arabia. Why nothing happened in Saudi Arabia? Because the Saudi are protected by the West. It is 9 million barrels of oil every day, and it is actually the cornerstone of moderation, as they call it in the West, stability. So I remember a friend of mine who works for the BBC. She went to have a visa from the Saudi embassy in London, and actually she was granted the visa, but she was kicked out after 3 days of her stay in Riyadh, because she was fishing for demonstration or protest. Anyway, she asked the Saudi official there, are you scared from these revolutions which is spreading in the Arab world? He said no, and it was very big no. She said why? She said simply because Al Jazeera, CNN, BBC wouldn't be there to cover it. So they feel they are protected by the Western media, or they can ban the Western media. And so if there is a revolution, it wouldn't actually publicized like the one in Egypt or the one in Tunisia. But I believe the unrest is there. It is true they managed to bribe the people about $100 billion to create jobs to pay for unemployment or unemployed people and for housing project. But maybe this will help, but in the short term, not in the long run.
Okay, thank you very much. William Morris.
Okay, I'll get the easy subject, Israel. I think Israel is actually, things are much more positive now with regard to any peace process, because we've removed the dead hand of Senator Mitchell from the process. And Senator Mitchell was really the big stumbling block to peace since the Obama came in, for two reasons. Principally, first of all, because he opposed Palestinian peace. He did that very strongly, very overtly. He spoke to Fatah, he spoke in Cairo. He was again and again and again against any peace between Hamas and Fatah. This was a major hang-up for anybody who believed in peace, because obviously there's no credible interlocutor in Palestinian terms without Palestinian peace. And he did this, of course, because of because of his instructions, and he certainly wasn't willing to go out on a limb. There was no way that the USA could tolerate Hamas being part of the PLO, which would be the downside of an agreement between Fatah and Hamas, and that was unacceptable because Hamas is a terrorist organization and so forth, and has yet to recognize Israel. So that was one big problem with Senator Mitchell. I mean, he's gone, and thank God for that, but now we can move forward. The other big problem with Senator Mitchell was that he bought into the Abu Mazen idea that we could have settlements hold up the peace process. Now, under Arafat and Yasser Arafat, he never allowed the Israelis to control the peace process. Senator Mitchell and Abu Mazen, between them, but very much reinforced by Senator Mitchell, decided that settlements could stop the peace process. So settlement building, Israeli's wonderful position for Israel. Now it could say, well, we build some more settlements, it takes us off the hook, we don't have to do anything or go anywhere, we don't have to have peace negotiations. So the Palestinians and Senator Mitchell put the Israelis in charge of dictating when and if peace negotiations would take place, because they gave them this get out. So now thank God he's gone, and we have a new window of opportunity in the Middle East. We had one, we thought, with the beginning of the Obama presidency. Mitchell put it on hold. Now I think we have a new situation in which we can go and move forward. It's interesting, we expect a major speech from Obama this weekend, and it's to be Thursday. It's to be his answer to his earlier Cairo speech, so move things on. And remember, he gave himself a window to September of this year for the creation, or implied that we would have the creation of a viable peace process that led to a viable Palestinian state in this time frame.
Okay, thank you all very much for sticking to the 2.2 minute condition. Can I just take it one point at a time? Now, you said there's a window of opportunity. In reality, and obviously we're going to talk about all the aspects of the power struggle between the Sunnis and the Shias, but in reality, how much change have we actually seen? We've seen movement, we've seen regimes being toppled, but where is the change? What change have we seen so far, and what change do you think we should expect to see in the next few months and the next 6 months? Abba.
Well, actually, when people talk about Arab Spring or Arab revolutions, actually, yes, it is very nice expression, very nice terminology. But what happened actually, we managed until now to change 2 regimes only. One in Tunisia and one in Egypt. We have about 22 Arab countries. So the change, the sweeping change actually did not take place until now. Well, yes, there is a revolution or uprising in Yemen, another uprising in Syria, a third one or a fourth one could be soon in the West Bank and Gaza. We don't know yet, but at least we managed to have 2 changes of the regimes there. I don't know. Once I was asked what's the difference between you in the Arab world vis-a-vis changing the regimes and us in the West. I said, we in the Middle East, we are backwards, we are illiterate, we are not westernized, but we managed to change 2 regimes with the minimum of the losses, while you in the West, Britain, United States, you managed to change 2 regimes by B-52, F-15, F-16, and you killed, 1 million people, especially in Iraq. And it cost until now more than $1 trillion. Who is more civilized, we or you? So I think we have to highlight this simply because it is extremely important. How those people in Tahrir Square in Egypt or in Tunisia, they managed to change autocratic regimes, deeply rooted because of their suppression, with a minimum of the bloodshed, about 400 people in Egypt, about 300 people in Tunisia. But when you look at the regime changes in Iraq, the regime changes in Afghanistan, my God, it is very scary, very frightening. So this is the difference between civilization and
But that change, and the opposite. But that change is frightening to those 3 countries that we're talking about. They're very, very worried.
Yes.
Who's worried the most? Is Iran worried because the rise of the Shia power in Hezbollah, in Lebanon, in Iraq? Is Iran worried about the Shia going back? Is Saudi Arabia more worried about? Is Saudi Arabia more worried about the rise of the Shia, and are we now witnessing a power struggle between Saudi Arabia Sunni and Iran Shia? Is this how you read it, Marwan?
You're using the language of the past,
Well, let's use the language. Tell us the language of the future. What's going to happen?
What happened as of December is that, presumably, with the exception of Saudi Arabia and Iran meddling in Bahrain, the language of sectarianism in Lebanon and Bahrain and Saudi Arabia, the language of religious sectarianism in Egypt and Lebanon and so on, took the backseat to a more civic language, the language of a new generation that is sick and tired of being divided on ethnic and religious sectarian lines. And so the youth that we saw on the streets of Tunis and Egypt and Yemen and Syria and so on, we've heard the slogans day in, day out. What they were saying is, we're against tribalism, we're against sectarianism, we're against our old generation's language. We're coming with a new jargon, if you will. Now, this in the perspective of what you just said earlier, and so we can all be clear, we'll be on the same page. I was just actually writing the last line as I came here to your event. Historical changes are short on shortcuts, and they're usually long on long hauls. That's why they're historical. What we've seen over the last few days, over the last few weeks and months, is just the beginning. And I think, as Mao Zedong once joked, when he was asked about the French Revolution a century before, what do you think of it? He said, well, time will tell.
Okay.
Time will tell.
Time will tell. Is it not true, though? I mean, you say it's the young people in the street, they saw beyond that. You're talking about Tunisia, you're talking about Egypt. But isn't it true that in the countries where struggle is still happening, it is still like this? It is the Sunnis in Syria who are most interested in regime change. It is the Shia in Bahrain who are most interested in regime change. Is this the language of the past? Have we gone beyond that? Or do you feel that we're still at that stage where, you know, the Shia support the Shia and they want an overthrow of a Sunni regime and vice versa? William?
Well, I don't think it's exactly like that, and certainly not in Syria. Certainly, I mean, one of the main non-religious opposition leaders, a guy called George from Katana. I can't remember his second name, but you know, he's a Christian, for goodness sake. I mean, so you get in Syria, you're getting people from all spectrums of society opposing the government, and it's very much as it was in Egypt. I think it's across. Everybody is up there. Everybody who has the guts for it is going for it. That's not to say that there's universal opposition to Syria's government. There are elements and major swathes of Damascus society that is pro the government, but nonetheless, those that are going for it, I don't see it as a sectarian fight, nor anywhere else. And I mean, some places like Iran, it completely breaks the mold, because there are dynamics within Iran that are really hanging things up very, very seriously inside Iran. I mean, there's the old fight between the supreme leader and Ahmadinejad, which is actually center stage now, and people are positioning themselves. Ayatollah Mojtaba Yazdi, who was with Ahmadinejad, has switched sides to the supreme leader and taken a whole swathe of people, including, I mean, the supreme leader's sons who were with Ahmadinejad are back on board with the supreme leader. People are finding positions, and there's a major fight going on in Iran internally, which Ahmadinejad is going to lose, in my view.
Okay.
But that's not the Arab Spring. So Iran has its own dynamic.
Yeah, but Iran's dynamic extends to Lebanon's Hezbollah and to Syria, and this is the non-Sunni circle that we're talking about.
I believe there is actually element of sectarianism spreading now on the verge of this Arab revolution. We are witnessing a huge sectarian polarization now in the region. If you look at Bahrain, for example, today all the Shia members of the parliament resigned. So it will be a parliament of the Sunni first. Second, if you look at the situation on Syria, you see most of the people actually who are revolting against the regime, they are mainly Sunnis. Yes. So we have to admit
which
that.
Is a Sunni
yes. And if you look at the movement of Saudi Arabia, Saudi Arabia is very important in order to understand what's happening in the Middle East. You have to look at the Saudi situation, how they move, how they interpret things. For example, the Saudi king had a row with President Obama when he couldn't save Hosni Mubarak, and until now they are exerting pressure on the regime in Egypt, and no investment, no loans, nothing. So when I say look at the Saudi Arabia, nowadays King Abdullah of Saudi Arabia came out with a very, very new ideas to expand Gulf Cooperation Council, which is elite club, is rich club, to enlarge it and to add 2 countries to it. These countries, Jordan and Morocco.
And they're not Gulf countries.
Yeah, no, they are not Gulf countries, but they are Sunnis. They are Sunnis because they want to have a Sunni.
But they're also monarchies.
And they are monarchies and Sunni mainly, because they are purely Sunnis. There is no Shias there. There is no Druze. There is no Alawite.
So do you see this as Saudi Arabia's new sphere of influence? Is this?
No, it is actually the fear itself. Saudi Arabia has a complex of fear. They are scared that the Iranian could create a lot of troubles on the Gulf region in particular. So they need a backup, a Sunni backup. They know the coming conflict in the region could be sectarian conflict between Sunni and Shia. That's why they want a reserve, a huge Sunni reserve on the Gulf Cooperation Council, because they are very small emirates or states, and they need some sort of security.
So when Iran sees this, Marwan, can just stand still and not react when it sees Saudi Arabia trying to do this out of fear, perhaps?
Of course not.
It's a new sphere of
that's
influence.
why Bahrain, as I said earlier, became a polarization field, even proxy conflict, if you will, between Saudi Arabia and Iran. But these are precisely what I was just saying earlier, and I will disagree respectfully. That they were trying to pull the region back to the past, Saudi Arabia and Iran, because it's within their interest. And I was telling you before we came in to the hall here, is that I don't know who chose Saudi Arabia, Iran, and Israel, and for example not chose Turkey, is the fact that these three countries have something very specific to them, although they are very different in so many ways, but there's something fundamentally specific and common to all three of them. The lines between state, society, nation, and religion are blurred. Unlike the various other countries in the region, these three countries, the very specific nature of religion, state, society, and nation are so intertwined that the idea of a civic society, the idea of a democracy that completely separates church from state is problematic. Hence, the first thing that comes to mind for them is to play a proxy, to play geopolitics, and to redivide. Now, the fact that the region has been plunged with sectarianism that Iran played or tried to play proxy in Bahrain and Saudi Arabia, Eastern Saudi Arabia, and Lebanon, that's not news. That's what's been happening in the region for many years now. What's new is that sectarianism is no longer alone, and Saudi Arabia, Israel, Turkey, if you will, and Iran no longer are the parties that divide and play everyone against everyone else. No longer can the security forces in Egypt burn a church in order to cover up for false elections and just get away with it, although in certain ways they're still going on with it. But what I'm saying is, what's new over the last 6 months is that there is a new struggle, there is a new force, and that new force speaks a different language. And that new language is precisely juxtapositioned against the old language of sectarianism, of religion, state, society. And that's what's interesting.
This may be true, but when we're talking about...
What do you mean, maybe?
Don't let them decide, I don't know. When we're talking about a worried Saudi Arabia, in that case, what is Saudi Arabia worried about? What is Iran worried about? They are worried about something. What is that thing?
They are worried about democracy. They are worried about, people actually.
But if we're talking about that, what you just mentioned, that Saudi Arabia sees the Gulf countries, and they're trying to include Jordan and the Sunni monarchies. They're trying to form some sort of an alliance against what?
Against
it must be a sectarian thing.
Yeah, it is first against their own people. Because Jordan and Morocco, well known they have the best intelligence service, they have the most suppressive security forces, they have a huge expertise in this, and this can be used for internal affairs to suppress any movement inside Saudi Arabia or inside Bahrain or inside there. The other is they know that the Americans are there. They know the Americans are there. They can, help them in facing Iran if there is a problem with Iran. But when it comes to the internal affair, internal uprising, they need the expertise of the Jordanian and the Moroccan. This is one thing. Talking about polarization, now if you look at the media in the Gulf, you see, Iran is actually demonized exactly the way like Saddam Hussein in 1990 and 1991 as the major threat to the region. They are talking about sleeping cells, they are talking about fifth columns, Iranian fifth columns in the region, in the Gulf state in particular. Even now in Egypt, you can see Salafists are working very, very effectively in order to derail the Egyptian revolution. You can see the sectarian element is well played by Iran and by Saudi Arabia in the same time, because this is the major countries who are will actually indulge in any kind of war, whether media war, whether political war, whether even a military war. So we don't know yet. But sectarianism now is is well played by the two countries in order actually to compete with each other and for the competition for influence.
Have some more.
William Morgan.
Yeah, well, I mean, on Syria, I disagree with Abdul Bari. I'm not sure that you can even describe the Alawites as Shiite. But anyway, with that aside, in terms of Saudi Arabia, I mean, I remember when I was a boy, we were talking about the fall of Saudi Arabia, and it still hangs on there. And why does it hang on? Because it's played the Shiite card.
Thanks to the British, man.
No, it hangs on because of it plays the demon Shiite card. It plays the sectarian card. It always I mean, there are a lot of problems in Saudi Arabia. There are internal problems. A lot of the kids, the ordinary kids in Riyadh, were really upset at the time because of the floods. And there were floods at the universities, and a helicopter was sent in to pick some princess out and left the rest of the university students. I mean, there was real anger amongst the Shabab in Saudi Arabia. And there continues to be real, genuine anger amongst the youth in Riyadh about their government, about the way they're neglecting the population, the things they are doing. However, the sectarian card, Abdul Bari's card, the Iranian Shiite card, is played by the Saudi government, and it is the thing that gets them off the hook time and again. They can say, there's the big enemy. We have the enemy within, and it means they have.
There is no enemy.
Well, of course there is, but the point is they're just. I mean, it is successfully played again and again and again, and it keeps that government stable.
But my question is,
without the Shiite minority in Saudi Arabia, the Saudi government would have fallen long ago. It is it's the best gift it has.
So that they're using that as a bogeyman.
Yeah, absolutely.
From their point of view, that enemy, is it not consolidating its power? Is it not making alliances that fit within this sector?
You're assuming it's an enemy.
No, I'm quote unquote.
You're assuming.
He said no.
I mean, you said, I didn't disagree with you. Is it an enemy? I mean, Marwan.
For the first 100 years, I'll play the devil's advocate for the heck of it. For the last 100 years and more, Iran has not attacked a single country in the area. It never attacked a single neighbor. It has a very aggressive Islamic revolution that is based right on top of its nation. It's certainly a seizable size with huge ambition, wants to play a role. Many it keeps telling its enemies it deserves to play a role. It is a major country, major oil, major military power, and so on and so forth. Now, does it by its own virtue of its presence and power and the fact that the US and its allies failed miserably in Iraq and Afghanistan and hence prepped up Iran's power? Yes, de facto, Iran became far more powerful after 2003 than it was before 2003. But the fact that its northern neighbor was attacked and invaded and occupied, and its southern neighbor was attacked, invaded, and occupied. Imagine if the United States was sitting as the Iranian forces invaded Canada and Mexico and occupied both of them. What would the United States do exactly? So the fact that the Iranians would get pretty defensive and would get pretty aggressive, and that Washington wants to a regime change in Tehran while they're occupying their southern and northern neighbors, and they start developing nuclear power, as Israel's leading military expert Martin Van Kerfeld once said, the Iranians would be stupid not to start developing some nuclear something now that their northern and the southern neighbors are occupied. Now, but having said that, that's no justification. That's mere explanation. And that's why I started by saying all of this, hopefully, and I say hopefully, I don't know exactly, I'm going to cross my fingers, but hopefully this is part of the past. Because if the Arab revolution succeeds, and if Egypt and Tunisia are the model, and by the time I come back here next time, since I was here, 3 months ago, Millicent? Yemen and Syria would have fallen in line, and so on and so forth. And there is a seizable Arab revolution, and there's a domino effect, and there's a dominant Egyptian presence. I think Iran would have to shut up and sit on the side.
Okay.
Of course, provided that Saudi Arabia and so on and so forth will play. And if you allow me just one last point. I don't want to talk too long. Talking about the Sunni axis and so on and so forth. I don't know if you and I are old enough to remember, but in 1979, there was...
Speak for yourself.
In 1979, there was this one American professor by the name of Jean Kirkpatrick, 1979. She wrote a very important article in Foreign Affairs called Totalitarian and Authoritarian States. And Reagan, at the time, as a candidate, read the article, and he brought her in, and she became the United Nations ambassador for the United States. And her thesis was very simple, and of course this became an indispensable part of the Reagan strategy, which was the US enemies, America's enemies, are the totalitarian states, meaning exactly those who have been falling, the Syrians, the Yemenis, the Iraqis, and so on and so forth. And Americans' friends are the authoritarian states, and these are the monarchies, right? And so all the monarchies, Jordan, Morocco, and the 6 Gulf countries became friends of the United States. Right? No, I'm just saying
we might as well
that was after the Camp David.
Yeah.
That came after. Before Camp David, of course, was an enemy. So the idea of monarchies versus republics, the idea of authoritarian versus totalitarian, believe it or not, is resurfacing now. And why? Well, because Saudi Arabia, Morocco, and Jordan actually do claim that there's certain legitimacy to monarchies, unlike republics who play monarchies. Meaning, one thing is to follow the Gaddafians, another thing is to follow the Saudi monarchs or the Qatari monarchs or the Emirates and so on. They claim to have a legitimacy, and hence they are trying to reunite. I think it's too late for them, but anyway, they're trying to do it.
Okay. Well, we've talked extensively about Iran and Saudi Arabia. Let's talk about Israel. Israel's watching all this and very, very worried. Israel is worried. You know, I just came from the BBC and I just done an interview with them, and they said we're very worried. What exactly?
Well, I'm very happy for that.
This is called product placement.
What exactly do you each feel Israel is really worried about? The rise of Islamism, the will of the people, as someone said to me today, that the will of the people is a lot anti-Israel than the regimes are.
I believe they are scared of democracy again. You know, they have a common things like Saudi Arabia. They know that if you have elected governments, if you have elected parliaments, you wouldn't have somebody like Hosni Mubarak there for 30 years actually serving Israelis more than serving his own people. So if you see that, you know, Egypt changes just about 3 months ago, and if you look at the Egyptian foreign policy toward Israel, you'll find it completely the opposite. For example, Nabil al-Arabi, the foreign minister, said, you know, if he warned Israeli from any invasion of Gaza. Actually, also he opened the gates to the Palestinian to leave freely from Gaza and break the sanction against the 1,750,000 people. So also you can see Egyptian people every day there is a demonstration against the Israeli embassies. They cut off the gas supply to Israel, Egyptian gas supply to Israel, you know, and maybe I don't know what else they can cut, you know, the coming few days. But anyway, you can see changes, sweeping changes are taking place in Egyptian foreign policy, Egyptian regional policy. Egypt now is regaining or trying to regain its position as a leading actually power in the whole region. So this is very scary to the Israelis, and also the sectarian problem. If you look, even Israel now, for example, we had that Obama will insist that Abbas should recognize, or the Palestinian should recognize Israel as a Jewish state, which is very, very dangerous here. We are going back 2,000, maybe 5,000 years back. So what worried Israel? Also, Israel is isolated now. When you just last Sunday, 2 days ago, few people pulled to the border of Israel and trying actually to go to Majd al-Shams and Golan Heights to areas.
Several were killed and several were wounded.
So they are scared. Imagine, a few thousand made Israel worried. So imagine if millions of Arab civilians decided to go to the Israeli border. Just say, okay, you want to kill? Can Israel kill 1 million, for example, 2 million? If you have
So when you say Israel is worried about democracy in its neighbors, William Morris, what does that mean? Does that mean that Israel knows that democracy will bring anti-Israeli rule to those countries?
Yeah, I mean,
this is the will of the people.
That's a dynamic, but it was Abdul Bari that said Israel was worried about democracy. I think Israel has two prime worries. One is that they're very worried about the Arab Spring and what that generates amongst the Palestinians. In other words, the move towards if you like to call it that, peaceful protest. And this has been flagged up for a while, and Israel has been very frightened of it. Marwan Bishara, for a long time, has been talking privately to his aides and the people with him about the idea of passive protest. So the idea, for instance, of Palestinians in large numbers lying down on the settler roads and this kind of thing in order to put Israel on the spot. Now we see the Palestinians doing this with their lives, and it is a dynamic, the Arab Spring, if you like, dynamic, the mass protest dynamic is something Israel doesn't know how to deal with. The other dynamic that Israel can't cope with is a peace process. I mean, Israel is very frightened of a peace process because obviously it would have to make sacrifices. Israel has moved to the right. You understand the dynamic in Israeli politics where the socialist parties are the establishment, the Labour, and the parties, the radical parties, are the right-wing parties. That comes because of Russian immigration. That comes of various dynamics. So it's upside down to the rest of the world, where your left-wing parties are radical. In Israel, your right-wing parties are radical, and the right wing is developing in strength. And they have a real problem in facing up to a peace process because it means sacrificing settlements. And how can they do that? It's a very, very bitter pill for Israel to swallow. So Israel's in a mess internally. It doesn't know how to cope with the Arab Spring. It doesn't know how to cope with its own people. It doesn't know how to cope with the peace process. And it's on the spot.
But Israel cannot say that it's against democracy. And my question was, is Israel worried that democracy will bring Islamism to some of those countries? Or is Israel not worried about Islamists reaching power, worried about just general democracy, secular people reaching power, and the secular people, are anti-Israel? Which one of the two is Israel most worried about, Marwan?
Well,
the Islamists or the secularists?
If we could just start, I've been trying to do it, but I haven't said that I've been trying to do it. Try to separate between, say, for example, the Ayatollahs in Iran and the Iranians, the Wahhabite regime and the Saudis, right? I think in these sorts of countries, sometimes when you say Britain, you more or less will be right on the dot. But in these countries, I think it's good to separate. Even in the United States, sometimes it's good to separate between what Washington says and what the rest of America believes, right? So I think the Israeli government is saying that what they're worried about is Islamists in Egypt, in Syria, and so on and so forth, coming together, taking on the government, and hence becoming very hostile to Israel.
That's what they say.
That's what they say. I think democracy in general, if it comes to the Arab world, and if it has Muslim Democrats being part and parcel of government, like Christian Democrats are being part and parcel of Western governance, meaning accepting constitutions, liberal constitutions, civic constitutions, separation to a certain degree between church and state, and so on and so forth, or some variations of that, then I think Israelis would have a better life in a more democratic, civic Arab region. Now, as it were, I think today the colonial regime, the so-called right-wing coalition in Israel, I think, and that's my analysis, is not exactly serving Israelis' interests. And I think if it would have embraced change in the Arab world, like the Europeans did quite late, but did nonetheless, started being on the right side of Arab history instead of being on the wrong side of Arab history, rooting for Egyptian change instead of
rooting for stability.
No, it's not only stability. They were actually badgering Washington for giving up on Mubarak until the last day. I mean, Netanyahu standing up and saying, "No, we need Mubarak." Excuse me, why do you need Mubarak so badly exactly? So you can, so that because Mubarak is the border man on the Gaza blockade, right? But I think the Gaza blockade is a temporary in nature. You cannot imprison people for 30, 40, 56 years onward. And at the end of the day, this is going to have to come to an end. That's why Israelis, hopefully, would think of the Arab Revolution, of the Arab change, of the Arab democracy, even if it does involve Islamists being part of government, as a window of opportunity to be embraced, to then have normalization of relations on the basis of international legality, that I haven't seen an Islamist that's going to stand elections in the countries like Egypt and so on and so forth that does not accept.
Okay. I'm conscious of the time, and I think 45 minutes we need to.
But let me add just something to democracy. Why Israel?
Quick word
why
before we
Israel?
open it
Scared of democracy? Because if you have elected parliament, properly elected parliament in Egypt, the first thing they will say, why we are selling our gas to Israel half price, for example. The second thing, say why we participate actually on the sanction against Gaza. The third, why are we actually caging, 1.5 million or 2 million people in Gaza and preventing them from actually running for their life when the Israeli bombarded them with phosphoric bombs, with shells, with the tanks, with everything. So, that's why Israel is scared of democracy. The same thing, if we have democracy in proper democracy in Jordan, people wouldn't allow the government, the Jordanian government, to listen to the Israeli dictation, for example. The same thing in Syria, the same thing in Lebanon. So that's why. And on the top of that, Israel will stop saying we are the only democracy in the region, which is a good reason.
Yeah, but the people who
are selling this to the West, say we are the only democracy in that part of the world. So this is the problem we are facing. So I believe they are scared of democracy because it will represent the will of people, and the will of people is against all the government policies toward Israel.
But the ones in the forefront of the fight against democracy was not Israel, it was us. Britain, America, the Quartet, Russia, the United Nations, who put these 3 hoops for Hamas to jump through and so on. I mean, we're the ones that really oppose democracy in the Middle East, and Israel is way behind us. I mean, I think we're in the vanguard there, surely.
Yeah. Okay. Right. Questions?
Hi. I'm just interested in the idea of the coming Iran-Israel war, if that's not a bit depressing to talk about it, but the fact that Iran, of all the different parties of most parties say that they want to get nuclear power / weapons, and Israel is set up on the basis that you never will get those sort of things. So the idea is this war's probably going to happen. Do you think the Arab Spring has made that war more or less likely? Has it accelerated the time frame, or what?
Are you addressing this question to any particular panelist?
No, whoever's got a good idea.
The coming Iranian-Israeli war, who wants to comment on this?
Well,
is it inevitable?
I don't think it was ever inevitable. I don't think it was even probable, to be honest with you. I think another adventure against Iran would have been not only stupid, it would have been suicidal for any coalition, Western or otherwise. Having said that, yes, I agree. If you had a leading question, as we say in television, then yes, the Arab Spring did delay or diminish whatever possibility was for conflict, proxy, indirect, by default, confrontation, and so on and so forth. What we've noticed, and this is, by the way, I mean, if you're, of course, living the news day by day, as unfortunately some of us have to, is that no one talks about it anymore. I mean, for the last 6 months, who heard anything? It turned out that you can resolve much of the problem with a virus. It turns out a computer virus, is more or less at least to delay the problem for some time to come, right? And certainly if you have...
Do not try this at home. Virusing is very bad.
Don't leave home without it, actually.
Yeah.
Well, anyway, having said that, I do think that whatever the intentions, the geopolitical intentions, were for intensifying that conflict with Iran at the service of certain global powers earning the loyalty of certain regional clients, that has taken the backseat because the region is going through different kind of transformation. That's why I plead with you not to ignore those very important questions, the ethnic, the geopolitical, the nuclear, the security, and so on and so forth. What I'm trying to say is, until fall of last year, that's the only thing we've heard. What we hear today, what we're involved, what we're in the process of today, is our transformations that are in direct conflict with those specific conflicts, tensions, confrontations that were paralyzing, blackmailing the region before winter.
So war is more unlikely.
Can I just come in
less
on
likely.
that? Just a little footnote.
Or less likely.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, certainly some of the Iranians that I speak to are not very concerned about a war at present. They were 6 months or a year ago, but now they see themselves as having a window until the US presidential elections in November 2012. There's no prospect of war until after that. The worry is for them, I think, is the Israeli elections, which will come, theoretically they could come as early as February 2013. This is assuming there's no seeming Netanyahu, but the more likely, those elections can be delayed under Israeli law up until the late summer of 2013. And the fear in Iran is that there might be an Israeli strike in the run-up to Israeli elections. I think I'm with Marwan. I don't think it's likely, because I don't think Israel feels strong enough. Had its fingers burnt in the 2006 war with Lebanon. But there is a risk. I still think there is a risk. I think it's unlikely, but there's a chance of this war taking place.
But still, the general tendency is that you feel it's less likely.
Well, I think it is likely, because the Arab revolutions gave Iranian a huge opportunity, a God-gift opportunity to speed up their nuclear programs. And this is very worrying to the Israelis. Nobody is paying attention to it. Israel used to escalate its rhetoric against the Iranian, managed to mobilize United States, the West against the Iranian. So the Iranian got at least 6 months to speed up, to develop the nuclear ambitions without the scrutiny of the West, without actually the threat of the West. So I believe this element in particular could push Israeli to go for a military adventure against the Iranian, because they did it in 1981, when they bombed the Osirak nuclear plants of Iraq. Suddenly, we wake up that the Israeli managed to bomb that.
But we live in a different world now. A strike like this against Iran, what could that bring?
Yeah, they did it. They did it against Lebanon. They did it in 1967 against Egypt and Syria and Jordan.
Century, 2011, is that gonna go unanswered?
Well, actually, definitely the Iranian will answer. If they have the capabilities, we don't know yet. But at least, but definitely they will, through Hezbollah, through Syria. We don't, through Iran itself. We don't know. But definitely, they wouldn't sit aside and just wait for. Yeah.
Okay. Just to clarify this, do you see war? I mean, obviously, from your question, inevitable. Is it a regional war? What exactly?
Not inevitable, no. But I mean, I think what you were saying about the fact that Israel's going to come under a lot more pressure from the Arab street now that Arab popular opinion will reflect Arab government policy a lot more.
Right.
That's bad news for Israel, like you're saying. That Egypt's just turned off the gas to them. That therefore means that perhaps the Israeli government feels a bit more threatened. I mean, Israel's unofficial motto is never again. We are never going to have mass killings of Jews, and no one is ever going to be in a position to do that to us.
Right.
And if their backs are up, if they feel cornered, they've done it, like you said, in Iraq in 1981. They did it to Syria in 2007 when they blew up some sort of nuclear facility there. I back them into a corner, and I think they'll hit people.
Okay, thank you very much. Lady in the front.
I wanted to ask what is the progress in the Arab Spring in terms of institution building? How is that affecting the region? And whether these countries have got the resources to meet the expectations of their revolutionaries?
Of their people?
Yeah.
Of their people.
Anyone?
Shall I? Yeah, I think.
Itching to answer.
Okay. There are definitely a lot of teething problems, especially in Egypt and Tunisia. And there is counter-revolutions forces, actually, who are trying to derail these revolutions. For example, Egypt has a deficit of $12 billion. And they are trying to find loans, grants, investment in order to compensate this. The foreign investment actually zero, according to the Egyptian finance minister, since the revolution took over. And also the foreign minister, the prime minister, Sam Farah, he went to the Gulf states hoping to raise some grants, some investments, some loans, but he went back home empty-handed simply because Saudi Arabia is so furious that the Egyptian revolution humiliating Hosni Mubarak and his family. They believed he's the chief of the tribe, and chief of the tribe shouldn't be humiliated. So I think, yeah, there are a lot of problems.
But to get back to the question, she's asking whether they will be able to build their own institutions.
Yes, because they are trying, but the problem is the West is not helping, the Arabs are not helping. So this is the major problem. You cannot actually do it alone in our world. You need the international help in a way or another. Until now, we haven't seen any sign of this help, despite the begging, despite the schemes.
What sort of help do the Egyptians need or expect in order to build their own institutions?
No. I'm talking about the investment, the economy, the institution. Yes, they will have presidential election. They will have parliamentarian election on September. After that, they will have presidential election. There is a huge movement toward this direction. So the process is actually going on. But the problem they are facing, the unemployment, the investment, the economy. So they are concentrating that to go parallel with this institution building. Until now, they haven't succeeded simply because they are besieged. They are cornered by Arab wealthy states, like Gulf states in particular, and also by the West, who are not, they are suspicious. They are not actually trying to help, whether in institution building or in economic building.
But
So
they can't help Abdul Bari institution. I mean, in Egypt, all the basic institutions were torn apart, and what was left was the army and the judiciary. But you can't ask the judiciary to control anything, otherwise you remove the independence of the judiciary. So all you were left with was the army, which had to step in and with the agreement, pretty much the tacit agreement of all the parties, take the lead role, and they've done reasonably effectively, or at least as well as you could expect them to. But the trouble is the young liberals and so on, the pillars of the new institution building, if you like, are busy squabbling amongst themselves. They're having a major problem in getting their act together, whether it's in terms of political parties or whether it's in terms of basic institutions, even women's organizations that they're establishing. Whatever it is, they're too busy infighting, and they're not quite getting their heads around things.
Surely that's
inevitable, maybe. Yeah.
In the early days after.
But actually, to be fair to Egypt and Tunisia, I guess, I think that there's solid institutions in both countries. That's why it was easier than the rest to get rid of the corrupt regimes. The army gave the example of what does it mean to be independent of a corrupt regime. I think the other institutions within Tunisia and Egypt were corrupted, but it's not that they didn't exist. In Egypt, they don't need to start from scratch, but they need a cleanup, an overhaul operation. So I think in that sense, have they started? No. Do they have the money? No. Is it possible? Yes. Is it probable in terms of institution building? Of course. What would it take financially? Well, here's the big question. I think there's two. I'll do the dreamy one, and I will do the realistic one. Which one do you want first?
Either, as long as it's brief.
The dreamy one is that there should be a Marshall Plan by the West and by all those who care about what happens there, whether they're Saudis or others.
Which is Netanyahu's great idea.
A Marshall Plan for the Arab world, whereby from now they will put a fund and they start participating and helping, and they will take every extra dollar that was raised on the barrel of oil since the Arab uprising started, meaning there's a lot of people pocketing a lot of profit now because of the Arab Revolution. Well, the Arab Revolution should take a share of it. So whoever is profiting from the rise of oil prices because of the Arab Revolution, that extra money needs to be directed back to the Arab world. That's a dreamy one.
That goes way beyond dreamy.
That's a dreamy one. No, it doesn't. Actually, it doesn't. Well, anyway, but it's dreamy.
Okay.
But the more realistic one, as I said earlier, it is going to be a longer process than people would have hoped. In the media, we're all talking about the Arab Spring and the Arab Awakening. In fact, what we are now in is the rude Arab Awakening. And it is, as all revolutions were, hard, long, arduous, but hopefully they're on the right direction.
So early days yet. Does that, another question? Oh, since you're in the back, sorry, we'll get back to you in a minute.
I just had a question about, it's quite short. What is the future of liberal interventionism after the Arab Spring? Now, is liberal interventionism also a language of the past?
Liberal interventionism.
The West messing
Yes.
with the Arabs.
So what I'm referring to basically is after 2000. Obviously, of course, you had 2003. You had the Iraq War, and you had the approach to the West, the promotion of democracy, and so on and so forth. With the Arab Spring, you get the people on the ground, getting on the street and getting democracy for themselves. And how does that change the dynamics of liberal interventionism?
Liberal intervention, meaning intervention for right to protect.
To liberate.
Right to protect and humanitarian causes.
Okay.
What we've had thus far is they're liberal when it comes to intervening in Bahrain, and they're interventionist when it comes to Libya.
Yes. I mean, to be honest, they can only take one bite of the cherry at a time. So, I know a lot of people in Syria from the government side are quite terrified of Western intervention. I don't think it's going to happen. We can't. It's too much for us. We'll see what Obama says in his speech on Thursday. I may be proved wrong, but I don't think anybody's going to go the extra mile with regard to Syria, which is why I disagree perhaps with Abdul Bari. I don't think the Syrian government is going to fall. But having said that, the Libya, of course,
I didn't say it will fall.
Okay. Well, I mean, oh, you did. Marwan did. Okay. Anyway, but no, it's too much. We can't. We have a lot on our plate. We've taken Afghanistan on foolishly, and we're losing badly there. And we're taking Libya on, and it's a poison chalice. Maybe going to result in the partition of Libya. We're very worried about the Libyan situation and the way things are going. So we were not going to go any further.
Scope for any more?
No, Syria, no.
I think yes.
In the near future.
There is a good reason for that. There were two liberal intervention on the Arab world. One in Iraq and one in Libya. It is not coincident that both countries are oil-producing countries. So if you see, it is true. There is no intervention in Yemen. No intervention in Bahrain except the Saudi one, which is not liberal at all. And there is no intervention in Syria or no-fly zone in Syria. And so the only intervention is on Libya, which is producing 1,600,000 barrels of oil a day, which is the best. Oil actually is very light and expensive. And in Iraq, and we discovered recently, according to the British paper, that the major reason for the intervention, not the regime change, not democracy, not the human rights, but the oil there. So it's very obvious. So if the liberal intervention is actually following the barrel of oil, I think it will be a disaster.
Such a cynic.
Apparently it's not liberal intervention, it's oil intervention. So these are the limits of intervention. You got the mic? Have you got the mic?
Yes, I assume the panel agrees that these revolutions were enabled by technology, and technology, needless to say, that were Facebook and Twitter quite close to the American establishment. I was wondering if the panel doesn't agree with that. I'd like to hear why, but also what the implication for those three specific countries are with their usage of technology, why the Iranian revolution has failed until now, despite heavy use of the technology, the different usage of technology in Israel, and I'm not an expert on the usage of such technology in Saudi Arabia, but the implication of the future 6 to 12 months of continuing usage of this technology that has only ever driven these two revolutions, as far as I'm concerned.
Do you think this technology is a catalyst, or did it play a role?
I personally can't see how these revolutions would have taken part in the way that they have without Facebook or Twitter.
You agree?
Well, I was just reading Albert Hourani's The History of the Arabs, and he talks about the first Arab awakening in the beginning of the 20th century, almost a century ago, 1905 to 1920. And in that chapter, he goes on and on to talk about trains, about buses. He talks about cities and cosmopolitan areas. He talks about newspapers. He basically talks about everything. If you take the actual name, Facebook, and put newspaper, you take out planes and you put trains, and you take out virtual areas and put cosmopolitan areas, you'll come up with the same thing. So Of course, every revolution, the French Revolution, the British Revolution, the American Revolution, all major changes had to have certain means in order to effect, in order to help, in order to implement. In today's world, those means happen to be more electronic than they are, say, mechanical, right? But they are, I don't want to say they're indispensable, they are paramount, they're important, but what's really important is the will of the people. What's really important is people's power. What's really important is to break out of the fear barrier. What's really important is to organize. And then when you have the will, when you have the intention, when you have the smartness to do that, those means become paramount and hence become helpful to you. But just to remind you, again, there's just a recent book by a Belarusian that just came out about the delusion, the net delusion, about why also regimes, and Iranian regimes was perfect at that, they also learn how to use technology against the people. So in Syria, for example, and I'll end with that, in Syria, for example, they learned the tricks from what happens in Tunisia, just like the Tunisians learned what happens from the Yugoslavians or the Romanians and what have you. What they've done is now they stop at someone in the street, young people, they stop in the street, say, what is your Gmail account? What is your code? You have to have an account, right? If you don't, you never leave the checkpoint. If you do, you give your Gmail, they open your Gmail, they check your check, and they see, have you been corresponding? Have you been doing this, that, and so on and so forth. In Iran, they were even smarter. They actually started policing the net. They start policing YouTube. They start finding out who's doing what, where, and so on and so forth. Anyway, all to say that eventually technology will become a double-edged, and it will be used with regimes as just used by the people. What will win is people's powers against autocrats. That's a decisive thing.
Just, let me add
presumably
something.
breaking down the barrier of fear is much easier when you know other people through Facebook are less afraid.
Yes.
On your own, it's much harder.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of exaggeration about the role of the social media in actually igniting the Arab revolutions. When I say that, because if you look at a country like Egypt, 40 million people under the poverty line, less than $2 a day. And if you look at the illiteracy rates in the Arab world, more than 60 million people are completely illiterate. In Yemen, for example, the internet is less than 1% or 2% of the population. So we cannot actually saying that it was the revolution of the Facebook. I believe Al Jazeera played a major role in igniting the revolution and spreading it, and also the other satellite channels. I mean, whether France 24, whether the BBC, whether. So I think we were in a way or another exaggerating the role of the social media in this revolution. It is true now.
But to be fair, he didn't say ignite. He said it was it
facilitated. But yes, but I believe the satellite channels, really played a major role, because people can see thousands or hundreds of thousands of people are demonstrating. It does encourage them to go to the streets and to break the
they're not mutually exclusive. They're not mutually exclusive.
And certainly
it helps. It's part of that.
The Facebook accounts help kick it off, and certainly in Egypt. But also there's another dynamic. The time has to be right. I mean, I was just looking at my diary. I remember Fareed Gadri, who is the Syrian opposition guy in the States, called for an uprising. I think it was on the 5th of February. It was a Saturday. And then within 3 or 4 days, I think the Muslim Brotherhood then called for an uprising on the 4th of February, the Friday. Nothing happened, and yet the Muslim Brotherhood were putting out street plans as to where people should come to, what they should do, how they should gather, where they should demonstrate. Nothing happened. Zero. Nothing inside Syria happened. So it was very much when the Syrian Shabab then took it on themselves, and they certainly used Facebook. They certainly used thousands of sites, thousands of people were signing up to 4 or 5 sites, Facebook sites, which were calling for demonstrations. So it was Syrian kids that drove this forward, not the Muslim Brotherhood, not Fareed Gadri outside. These groups failed, and then the Syrian kids took it forward, very much in the Egyptian model. I mean,
but I must say, and we need to move on so we can hear some more questions, that I think from our work in television, we've seen how the user-generated content, which is Facebook and everything that people did on their mobile phones, was then sent to the international, to the broadcasters, and then the new media worked hand in hand with the old media. And this is something I said in the last Frontline lecture. They worked hand in hand to enormous effect on the streets. So I think, in this case, old media played.
But it's not old media, it's just old.
No. I mean, I'm calling it.
It's not old.
Just to differentiate it from the new media.
Sam, the Facebook introduced to Syrian society actually after the revolution, not before it. The government allowed the Facebook for the first time after the revolution.
After what revolution?
Can we just,
after Syrian
can we just
revolution.
hear please, one more question. Gentleman in the back.
The word democracy has been bandied about a lot. Now, democracy is actually a very complex thing, both in theory and practice. And I would like the three speakers, if they would give us, if possible, a very brief definition of what they mean by democracy. For example, there's the question of the relationship between political and economic power. Take Egypt, for example. I understand that the army there was not only a military force, but also a very strong economic force, and it remains so. Can we, rather than just saying, oh yes, democracy, we all want democracy, what does it actually mean in practice?
Okay, the definition of democracy, and as he said, briefly, and so we need a definition of briefly tonight. So instead of asking all three, if I may, Alan, can you just name one person, one panelist to answer this question so we can hear other questions? Do you want me to? The gentleman sitting next to me. He likes you.
Well, I'll tell you what. Let me start by just saying why I don't think it's the rule of the majority. Because I know this is the conventional wisdom, and especially in the Arab world and in the South in general, in countries that lack democratic tradition, there is this idea that you get the majority, you change the constitution, and you rule by decree. That's not democracy. So let's just start by saying that democracy is not the rule of the majority, or it's not merely the rule of the majority. So what it is, well, for me, democracy is the rule of the democratic values. What are the democratic values? They could vary slightly between tradition and tradition, between one historic phase and another. But they simply have to do with representative government, they have to do with civic and human rights, and they have to do with separation of religion and state, they have something to do with individual and universal rights, and so on and so forth. So there are simple ideas, and I will just choose one of them now that I just mentioned to you, about minority rights. In so many ways, majorities can win, but if there are no constitutions that protect minority rights, then it's absolutely no democracy. And that's why there has to be universal agreements. And universal, I don't mean it has to be implemented everywhere the same way. What I'm saying is that there has to be certain human rights, and in the Arab world particularly, there has to be certain minority rights protected under a representative constitution, where you have a representative government that could be changed and exchanged whenever the people decide to do so, while the individual and the collective rights of people, of religions, various minorities are protected. Unfortunately, I'm not sure.
Critics of this policy would then cite Lebanon as an example of stalemate after stalemate because all the minorities are represented.
No, it's actually, Lebanon is a completely different case. What you have in Lebanon is quota system. Quota system is sort of a transition towards democracy, meaning in certain places now they're thinking of it, okay, let's give women, although they are half and even more of the society, let's give them certain seats in the Iraqi parliament, for example, just to make sure. Although they are half of the society, and looking at history, they're far more intelligent than men, and maybe they should have far more than half the society. But anyway, having said that, I think when I say universally, I mean that minority rights needs to be protected, but doesn't mean that minorities, according to their rights, need to govern.
Have the quota. That doesn't mean that.
That doesn't mean democracy at all.
Okay. Gentlemen.
Yeah, at the beginning, Mr. Morris sounded very optimistic about what the Arab Spring might have the effect of the peace process between Israel and the Palestinians. But I would like to suggest that maybe that is too optimistic, is that the Israelis seem to be in a lager mentality, and one reason is because there's no real pressure on them. Obama actually sort of over the settlement issue rolled over completely to Netanyahu. What happened at the weekend, the State Department reaction to the weekend events was very bland, and Netanyahu will be in Congress next week when he'll probably get a standing ovation. So there's really no pressure on Israel to do anything apart from put up the sandbags and keep shooting. Well, I guess that was a statement rather than a question, but would anybody care to sort of agree with the negative line?
Anyone like to comment?
Well, I'd just come in. I mean, there are pressures on Israel. There are immense pressures on Israel. One of the biggest pressures on Israel, I mean, many friends of peace in the Middle East have been pushing for the Palestinians to declare UDI for decades. I mean, and only now, as in the past year, has Nabil Shaath been pushing a program, and the Palestinian government in Ramallah, such as it is, has been moving forward with that program to try and persuade states to recognize Palestine, recognize a Palestinian state on the 67 borders. It's hugely threatening to Israel, and we're coming up now to the UN General Assembly meeting. There are deadlines that Obama put in place, perhaps foolishly, but he put them in place. He was talking about a peace process within a year. So Israel is under pressure, I would argue, and I think that we are in quite a positive moment. The only thing is we need to get out of this quick fix mentality. We've had this mentality where we need a peace process that works tomorrow. I think we need to buy into kind of working over a few years instead of a few months towards peace. Then we can really make progress. I think it's quite dangerous to think of peace tomorrow instead of working for a longer term agenda.
Shall I add just little? Yeah. I believe the most important things of this Arab Spring, they are not actually destroying the barrier of fear toward the Arab regimes, also toward Israel. Honestly, this is the most important developments. People, masses now, they don't fear Israel. You know, they are more confident.
Is that good?
And this is, I believe this is extreme. No, this is bad for Israeli and good for the Arabs, to be honest. You know, for the first time, you know, the younger generation, you can see that. You know, yesterday, for example, 300 people were injured because of the clashes with the police in the front of the Israeli embassies. We never witnessed something like that in Egypt in particular, after, say, 30 years of Camp David agreements. So it shows you how the whole area is changing. And Israel wasted a very, very golden opportunity to strike a peace deal with the Palestinians. Now it is more complicated. Abbas will be extremely careful when he talks about peace nowadays, because despite the reconciliation, people now, the mood is completely different. They are not scared of the Israeli. And you witness some Palestinians managed to cross the border via Golan Heights and they reach Tel Aviv. You know, what the Israeli can do, if, as I said in the beginning, if we have masses, if you have millions, for example, decided to mass toward the Israeli, what the Israeli can do, as I said, use their nuclear bombs against them.
But why didn't that happen? The people, millions of people marched in the streets of Cairo and so on because they believed that they could bring change. Why didn't the Palestinians march?
Yeah, because the Arab governments wouldn't allow them to march because of the fear of the Israelis.
They allowed them
now what's happening in Tahrir Square. I believe it is a rehearsal, for the march, the biggest march toward the Israelis. It will come. I'm sure it will come.
On the day of Nakba or the Israel Foundation, they were allowed to march.
Yeah.
In southern Lebanon, in the Jazeera, and they didn't.
Because the Syrian, for the first time, they decided to make a diversion from the internal uprising to
the Israelis.
Yes. So they allowed you can see the most important marches took place on the Golan Heights, on Maroun al-Ras in South Lebanon, and also in Beit Hanun in Gaza.
Yeah.
So you can see, and there is Kalandia also checkpoints in West Bank. So, but you can see the major 3 marches took place because of actually the green lights from Hezbollah and from the Syrian and from Hamas.
Yeah.
And it is very indicative here. So if one Arab country decided actually to break the equation and allow the Palestinians or the other Arabs to march toward the Israeli, it will be a disaster to the Israelis.
So you both agree that Israel has plenty to worry about?
Oh, for sure, I think.
Okay.
Thank God.
A question from there, please.
Sorry about this. This will be a bit inarticulate, but since we were arguing earlier about the word democracy, are you absolutely sure that the word revolution is correct? Definitively so. Bearing in mind, let's say the Romanian revolution, the body of the regime basically stayed the same. The Securitate stayed in power. They still are in power. Russia recently, the KGB morphed into the mafia, and judging by the power and secrecy of the Supreme Military Council in Egypt, is it really revolution that we're looking at?
Are we actually witnessing a revolution, or is this some sort of a what? What could it be other than a revolution? Just a change?
Top the head off, the body stays the same. So
okay, and then regenerate into another similar, identical head to the previous one.
Sort of thing.
Yeah. Okay, so no change. Basically, there is this possibility that all this will lead to the same.
Remember, I just rephrased that joke from Mao Zedong about the French Revolution. He said a century later, we will see. In the sense that there are no revolutions without evolution. Although we tend to separate revolution from evolution in the sense that there's a break, there's a sudden something. In fact, no revolution happens without an evolution before it, an evolution during, an evolution after. So the idea of a revolution, when they were, say, faster and swifter, that's when they were far more violent. And to my mind, the results were far worse. If you look at the Russian Revolution onward, and even certain phases of the 1848 French Revolution, the violence was the worst part of those revolutions. If you can have a revolution that takes longer, meaning the evolutionary process within the revolution takes longer, meaning short on shortcuts and long on long hauls, you will have far better results on the long term. Now, having said that, what we've seen is two different things, and here it's your choice how to title it. If you look at something that happens within the Arab system, you had 6 upheavals in 6 months, happening in various countries, with sometimes little in common in terms of the way it's run, and a lot in common in terms of they all speak the same language. So within the Arab human landscape, we had revolutions, upheavals, uprisings in Syria, Yemen, Tunisia, Egypt, Bahrain. What did I miss?
No.
Anyway, 6.
Little Oman.
So, and of course, Algeria is sort of coming around. Morocco is coming around as well. Oman has come around, and so on and so forth. If you take a look at each and every one, of course, you will see that Yemen, it's evolving. We're not sure where it's heading. In Egypt, they cut the head of the snake, as it were, and we're not sure if the whole regime it will change, because here the question of a revolution would be not who will replace Mubarak, but what will replace the Mubarak regime. But if you look at the last 2 months with the Mubarak family in jail, with the Mubarak regime, a lot of its symbols in jail, with elections having already taken place, a constitution has been approved, elections will take place in October, there is an evolutionary process taking place.
And you're hopeful that this process will lead to something different from what the Egyptians and Tunisians had before.
And this is the
not similar.
And this is the big, of course. This is the big question.
Well, I think this is the question.
No. I mean,
call it a revolution, until it produces something different.
No, there are failed revolutions, right? Revolutions fail, but the idea here is: do you call them revolution only after they succeed, or you call them revolution because? And here is, I think, for me, is the underlining sentence: are there radical, massive calls and implementations for change on a massive scale? Meaning, are we just trying to change something within for the time being in a transitional way, or are the people in the Arab world today asking in a massive way for massive change? in that sense, it's a revolution. In sense of what's happening in each individual country, probably it's more of an upheaval here, an uprising there, a revolt here, a revolt there.
So
and the overall, I think there is an Arab revolution.
It's case by case, actually. I mean, you have to take Egypt, for instance, is a case by itself. And
can we be very, very brief?
But clearly there's been a push for genuine parliamentary democracy. The young people want that. The people of Egypt want that, and that will be delivered. Then the question is whether 2 months after the parliamentary elections, when we get the presidential elections, are we going to go back to the same old thing? And the test will be, if you see Ammar al-Musa elected, which he may be, then you'll have an old army guy, the same old thing, same old, and you'll go on. Or will you see new people coming forward, new blood? I think you will see new blood in Egypt, and I think new blood means, yes, it's a genuine revolution, in my view.
Okay. This brings us, I'm terribly sorry, I think we need to finish now just because people expect it to finish at 8:30, and I just want to stick to that. It's like a television program. So this actually brings us very nicely into the end, because I'm going to ask each one of you within 1 minute, and I'm going to time you this time, 1 minute to tell us about your view, what you think is going to happen in the next 6 months. Because Marwan at some point said, when I'm here next time in 3 months' time, Syria would have fallen.
Hopefully.
Yemen would have fallen. So what is your vision? What do you expect to happen in the next 6 months? And if we start with William Morris, and really within 1 minute,
sure,
just very briefly tell us what you think is going to happen.
Well, just in terms of governments, yeah, Syria,
and especially with Syria, with Iran,
Syria and Israel,
and Saudi Arabia and Israel.
Sorry, around Saudi Arabia and Israel. Saudi Arabia, I don't think anything will change. Iran is in a process of change, but it's longer term, and we're talking not in 6 months. So we're talking. I think they may even let Ahmadinejad hang on till the next elections, but I think he is doomed ultimately, and the Ayatollah. The establishment, the Revolutionary Guard, if you like, establishment will seize control and take control and re-establish their authority. And that's, I mean, the West has been busy negotiating with the mainstream government rather than the Revolutionary Guard, and they've been caught on the hop by developments in Iran. In Syria, the same government. I don't think Syria is going to fall. Libya, I think Libya won't partition. I think Libya will be. I think we'll see a truce, and we'll see a move towards elections. I think it's that or Gaddafi falls, but I don't see Libya becoming divided. Yemen, however, will partition, I believe, and will fall within this next 6 months. Will split into 2 countries.
That is perfect 60 seconds. I'm serious. I'm just very out of fun. 60 seconds. What's going to happen?
And a half. 60 seconds and a half.
No. We have to be fair.
Personally, I believe the regime in Syria managed to weather the storm until now because they used the maximum of the suppression, and the West did not help the way they helped in Libya. If we go to Yemen, I believe Yemeni is the weakest link actually, and I could see in 6 months Ali Abdullah Saleh is actually going to exile in Saudi Arabia. When it comes to Libya, I think it is extremely difficult situation. I could see a partition of Libya, 2 states, and we go back to the 1943 when Libya was partitioned between French and British. So I can see the French and the British will have Benghazi. So Gaddafi, because it is a tribal society, and Gaddafi managed to steer fast until now. Also, there is a possibility of Libya changing to a failed state, and like Afghanistan, and this could be extremely dangerous for Al Qaeda and other extremist organizations to set up bases there. Saudi Arabia will actually continue to use the sectarian sects against the Iranian, and I could see some skirmishes between Saudi Arabia and Iran vis-a-vis Bahrain. The situation is very tense there, so it is possible that we'll have some escalation between the 2 countries. Iran could use the Shia and the eastern side of Saudi Arabia, and so I anticipate some problems between Saudi Arabia and Iran in the coming 6 months.
Thank you very much, Marwan.
Look, the way back is not the way forward, that we know. We have broken away from the past. So we're going into uncharted future. I think if the last 6 months are anything to go by, we'll probably have another 6 upheavals in the next 6 months. If Libya is anything to go by, there is a rude awakening, and change is not going to be as easy as Tunisia and Egypt. With Yemen basically falling apart soon, probably not as violently, I think we will see a new pressures towards that change. A lot of factors will play. For example, if the United States and Europe will stop being so cynical, will stop being so neo-colonial and so arrogant and so condescending, and will start helping and getting seriously on the right side of history. Not, we'll just get onto Libya because a specific case, there is oil, Gaddafi is, we hate him anyway, and so on and so forth. But we are serious about this southern neighbor of ours, the 300 million Arabs. Then I think that transformation that's going on in the Arab world will end up putting Saudi Arabia, Israel, and Iran on the defensive. They will become a far better and viable partners for Turkey, for Europe, and others. And in a sense, they will set a model whereby no longer will the people of Iran be able to avoid it. And I think the virus will spread to Iran, eventually will spread to Saudi Arabia in various ways. And I think Israel would have to reconcile itself somehow, and no longer will be looking to Washington for solutions. We'll start looking for more universal solutions. And I think in that sense, Israel-Palestine could potentially be a better place.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Can I thank the panelists? Thank you very, very much. It's very interesting discussion. William Morris, Abdul Bari Atwan, and Marwan Bishara, thank you all very, very much. And thank you everyone, and I'm terribly sorry if people didn't have a chance to ask any questions, but I'm sure people will be hanging around, so if you want to ask a question, go ahead. But, perfect.